And we are live here, episode 7 of the Lucas Grandsire podcast. Very excited about this guest today. It is, of course, the great Brendan Fitzgerald, the man behind FITZ TV, FITZ Nation, all that good stuff. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing good, Lucas. Thanks for having me on, man. Excited.
Of course, and I'm sorry I was trying to time it with the people drinking during the interviews. You try to time it so you can drink while you're
Oh
talking,
man.
bro. We messed it up on the first one.
Oh, we're just hanging out, man. I'm taking a sip of water and I'm good.
Because when you talk to the fighters, a lot of them, they're sipping on something, BCAs or stuff, if they're responsible with the gym, and then you have to time it so that even if your question is about the cutoff as they're about to drink, you have to try to stretch it as much as you can so that it makes sense, and
Yeah,
you don't
exactly.
you don't hear
Exactly.
them guzzling it down or anything.
Yeah,
So
man.
let's
That's how it
yeah.
works. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, so you're also working today, man. I assume you're what, quarantining in the hotel, or how does that kind of work ahead of the show?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in a hotel. The pattern has been every Friday, I get a test during the week and then every Friday come down to the hotel. It's relatively close to the apex. But even for Las Vegas based employees, which I live out here in Las Vegas. But since I'm going to be on the arena floor, if you're going to be on the arena floor, interact with the fighters at all, you got to spend the previous night in a hotel after getting a test. And then the test comes back clear and you're cleared to go to work. So that's been the pattern since May, since we started doing shows from the apex.
Now, has it gotten it tough so far? Because I know some people they don't mind it, others a little bit tough, and it must be weird for you too because you live in Vegas, so it's like you're quarantining near your home. But is it getting tough?
Yeah, I mean, it's not. Um, I don't know. It one of those things where in some ways it's good. Like it's good to because usually we're traveling for shows and I'm just in a hotel by myself. So, when you have a family at home, sometimes it's good to get away and just have a quiet room to do what you need to do, put all of your focus on the show, in the, 20, 12 hours, 18 hours before the show. But on the other side, man, sleeping in your own bed if you're here in town is just the best. Like I can't sleep as well here. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I'm always waking up at like 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, trying to doze back and things like that. So yeah, no, there's good and bad, like with anything.
So one thing I'm curious about is we see you guys, you're doing these 3 hour, 4 hour, even longer shows. Wow, how do you guys do with the bathroom breaks? Like I assume you got to start getting antsy at some point. Like you must have it down to a science at this point.
So for me, it's not a science necessarily. I've been trying to figure that out because like you said, it's a long time to talk. I mean, sometimes we're on the air for 6 hours. There's
Yeah.
there's very few jobs in broadcasting, period, that are 6 hours of talking. And so that's a lot. And also to speak with such energy, and if you get some finishes and fun fights, you're
Yeah.
yelling. So you want to keep your voice good, and the way to keep your voice good is to stay hydrated. So you want to stay hydrated, but then of course bathroom breaks. You know, um, I'm not one of those that takes a lot of breaks, and it's possible to go through a full show to not have to use the restroom at all. But if you do, there's strategic points. Like if we're gonna go, I mean, generally the time for the play-by-play announcer to go is right after we read the lead to a feature of like the fight coming up, right? You'll kind of get that sound that everyone knows the next fight is coming, and then we're on like a recording there, and then the fighter walks happen. And a lot of times the fighter walks happen on commercial breaks. So, tonight I'm working with DC and Bisping, and so it's good to have two guys on the call with us. And so, if I need to take a minute or two or whatever and run back there. And then you got two walks, which is almost like, 3, 4 minutes plus the combo feature. I mean, you're talking about 5 minutes there to sneak it in if you can. Or if we get some early finishes and we use the desk crew to kind of fill in the gaps, like at the end of the prelim, sometimes we have like a 10-minute break. So
Yeah.
we always make it happen.
I feel like with the voice thing, like if a regular person were to try to do what you guys do, by the end of the show, they'd be calling the main event, and be like, we're gonna see all these guys. They sound like Tony Robbins at that point. Like it really does sound like it would stress your voice a lot.
It does, man. And you got to take care of it. Like I've had some shows where I'm like raspy on the main event call, and it's like that's the highest profile fight. Like if like I've been under the weather, last year when we went to Rochester, I remember, and so then like by the time the main event, you're like your voice is just holding on. You're doing whatever you can, and like I said, it's a long time to talk, but generally it's just you just get it done. You just kind of figure it out. Like I said, like I still add to my routine in terms of like what I'm gonna do. Like just drink more water, but you don't, just try to figure it out. But staying hydrated to me is the most important thing. And then maybe not overtaxing your system early in the night if you don't have to, like being strategic with it while still providing energy for the moments that need it. And then yeah, man, you want those big moments to sound good. And the next day, Sunday, it's like,
Oh yeah.
it's like Sunday, your voice is going to be raspy. It's kind of it's like it's pretty raspy on a Sunday, that's for sure.
So before we go any further, though, you are of course a Boston guy. I'm here in North Carolina, so I have to point it out that the Boston Celtics took an important man from the Charlotte Hornets, probably the most important player we've ever had because we have a storied history or whatever, and it feels like you guys already want to trade him. So I feel like you're a Boston guy, got to pick on you, right? Got a bone to pick a little bit. You took our franchise guy.
Kemba, right?
That's right, Kemba Walker, of course.
Yeah, I'm not a big NBA guy though, to be honest. I've never like I loved playing basketball with my friends, but I was always a hockey player growing up. And then you know, like I'm not like I don't hate the Celtics, but I don't love them either. Like I don't really pay much attention to them. I just know, Boston is a tough place, man. It's like once and now that I live in Las Vegas and I've gotten outside of Boston, when you can look at it from the outside in, it's a much different place. When you're in it, you're just like, yeah, man, these guys got to win. What the hell, man? This,
Yeah.
and you trade, you'll be happy to have a new athlete come in, and then like when they don't do, they're quick to get rid of them. Say, the hell with that guy. And when I moved outside of Boston, kind of saw that from the outside in. I'm just like, wait a second, that's not cool, man. Like, why do we celebrate, being so tough on our players like that, to the point where, like, especially after winning all these championships.
Yeah.
So I don't know, man. What's the story with Kemba? I didn't know they wanted to trade him. I know that they got rid of Gordon Hayward, right? He just signed somewhere else.
He signed with Charlotte on a huge deal that's going to mess up our cap space. So, Boston keeps jabbing North Carolina like that. And it's like,
Yeah,
and I'm not even from North Carolina, but it's like living here,
right.
you have to have a certain amount of, because if you tell people, like, for example, you're a Lakers fan, it's like, okay, so have you been to LA? No. It's like, what's your ties with California? Nothing. So, you gotta, you gotta pick the
Yeah,
team
it's a
that makes
different
sense.
world, man. Yeah.
Well, at least for you, you have Las Vegas doesn't have that many franchises. I think you just got hockey. I think football as well. But like you get to choose between everything. Like whoever's winning, you have an excuse to go for them.
Well, I mean, nobody wants that kind of fan. I mean, I was talking to my nieces and nephews the other day on FaceTime, and I was like, "Who's your favorite football team?" And they all said the Chiefs.
Yeah. Mm.
Right. They all said that, they're like 5, 6, and 8 or whatever. But it's just like, oh, okay. I remember in the early 90s when the Cowboys, won 3 in a row, and everyone loved Aikman, Urban, Emmett. And everybody was a Cowboys fan. That's how they got the nickname America's team. And so the Chiefs are the new Cowboys of the early 90s, and everyone loves the Chiefs. But I don't want to be a front runner. I root for people that I like more than
Yeah.
teams that I like. But I'm here in Vegas, so it's like the Raiders. Having an NFL franchise is cool in a brand new stadium. Can't wait till we can go and fill that thing up. And then the Golden Knights are a cool story because they didn't come from anywhere else. They're truly Vegas's team, and they say Vegas born. And people have a lot of pride in that.
Yeah. It's like people are talking about, the Chiefs, and it's like, are you from Missouri? Have you ever been? Could you point to
Yeah.
Missouri on a map? It's like,
Yeah,
what are
you
what are
put
we doing here?
Mahomes on the cover of Madden, and he's like
Yeah.
the MVP, and they have a fun offense to watch. Everyone wants to watch the cool offense that puts up a bunch of points and that can score in a blink of an eye. So that's where you get that.
Well, in basketball too, everybody was a Golden State fan, and you
Yeah,
had all the
same
kids
thing.
wearing the stuff, and then they kind of lose everybody, and now you're like, hold on, I thought everybody
Yeah,
was from San Francisco.
everyone's
What
back
happened?
on LeBron now. Everyone's back on LeBron.
Yeah, that's
Steph
right.
Curry was the guy. Now everyone forgot about Steph Curry.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, yeah, it's fun too. But you can't take those fans too serious. At least I don't. It's like if you talk to someone about basketball, and it's like LeBron's my favorite guy. And it's like, oh, really? Like is that fun? Is it fun to be for necessarily the best guy every time?
Well, you don't want to switch around, but
Yeah,
I don't think there's any problem with rooting for greatness. I think
yeah,
there's too many people that try to negate it, like people that dump on LeBron or Tom Brady or whatever. It's just like, do you understand how good they are at what they do? Like, so I don't like when people just hate the best guy, but also you don't want to be like, oh, I'm a Lakers fan now. Oh, now who's winning? Whatever.
exactly. But it's fun to watch the greatness aspect too, because like people they go back in time, they talk about all these greats like Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and stuff, which was before my time. But then today, people will look back and they'll be like, man, the LeBron era, the Tom Brady's and stuff. And it's like, we were a part of that. We got to see that live. And
Yeah.
I think people take that for granted too, especially with guys like LeBron who get so much hate, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and in the age of social media, there's almost like more hate to go around.
Yeah.
I mean, there was plenty of people that, if you're a Celtics fan, you hated the Lakers, and if you're a Lakers fan, you hated the Celtics. But just with the way the media culture is now, it's kind of in a different way. I think as long as you take pro sports for what it is, which is it's ultimately entertainment for people. For plenty of people, it's their livelihood and it's their jobs, and there's a lot of jobs connected to it. And we learned that this year when it's shut down. There's a lot at stake in terms of the dollars and cents for people and their jobs and how they make their living. But when you're talking about like an athlete and the teams and the standings and the wins and losses, I mean, I think you got to all take it with a grain of salt and realize it's entertainment for the fans, and it's a lot of fun. So if you take it too seriously and
Yeah.
don't make it fun, then you're missing the whole point.
Well, speaking of which, a lot of people, or I think it was in January when we saw Stephen A. Smith was making the comments on Cowboy and stuff, and MMA fans were up in arms. And, I think that's the moment a lot of people realize that MMA fans aren't necessarily sports fans. Like, if you like all sport, like basketball and stuff, and Stephen A. Smith, it's not crazy to hear him say something about Cowboy. But then, I mean, have you seen sort of like MMA fans are also sports fans? Because it does feel like there's a difference, at least in my opinion.
I think just as MMA grows, you're going to get more crossover.
Yeah.
And a lot of people now, like, how old are you, Lucas?
I'm 23.
23. So you were born in what, 97, 98?
97. Yeah.
97. So like, and this goes back to when, not even like when I was a kid, 80s, 90s, there's so much less out there, right? Before the internet existed, like you couldn't just look up your favorite team's highlights and all that sort of stuff from wherever you were just kind of. So I guess what I'm trying to say is people were into the same stuff because the
Yeah.
same stuff was on everybody's TV. You know what I mean? Like, kind of like if you wanted to watch sports on TV, you had to watch ESPN, and they had like one channel, and then they had two channels. And if you wanted to watch whatever your interest was, it was on like this channel for this show. And now you can just be so deep into one thing that's more specific, niche sports and niche activities, right? That there's more separation in terms of what people are into. So, there's less crossover maybe. Like if you were just a sports fan, then you knew that then a lot of people, you watch Sports Center, and then you kind of like, if you lived in California, if you lived in Massachusetts or Minnesota, you just watch the same Sports Center. And now it can be very targeted based on what your specific interests are. Like if you're a Patriots fan, you could just choose to watch, you could just know the Patriots inside and out. And if you don't, obviously you're going to have a grasp of the NFL at large, but like you could just know everything about the Patriots. And or pick the activity or sport or whatever you're into. So with MMA, it's one of those sports where it's a niche sport. People get obsessed with it.
Yeah.
It's just it's a way of life, and it's a passionate thing. But they are bigger sports fans, and so as MMA grows as a sport, you're just gonna pick off some people that like I don't really follow the NBA, but it's just like I've always been a hockey fan, and I love the NFL. So it's just like, well, the three sports I pay attention to is like NFL and hockey and MMA. Like there's room to be a fan of a few sports. Now you're not necessarily going to be a huge fan of the NFL, the NBA, baseball, college football, and then the MMA and know a bunch about everything. Like you got to pick and choose what you consume in addition to whatever else you have to take care of with your job and your family and whatever. So, I think MMA growing as a sport, I noticed that there's a lot of hockey fans that like MMA, right? There's
Yeah.
fights in hockey, but
Yeah.
it's just like a rough sport. The athletes are really down to earth like they are in MMA. They're easy to root for. They're grounded. There's real drama. It's a fast moving, exciting sport, and hockey's kind of up and down, hard hits and that sort of thing. So obviously the UFC is huge in Canada. I think that there's, no mistaking that. So that's the trend that I kind of noticed when I was kind of making my entry into UFC and MMA. But it's gonna get more people's attention because we're on ESPN, we're on a bigger platform, and the more eyeballs that are on it, the more people that are gonna be like, this is pretty cool. And that's exactly what we've seen.
Well, the thing about MMA that I think, maybe fans don't realize as well is just how much access everybody has to everything. Like, Jeff Neal and Stephen Thompson are fighting this weekend. You could literally type in their name and put interview next to it and find all these interviews that they did. Like, you can get to know these guys outside of simply fighting. And like you mentioned, watching the highlights, like you can know a guy inside and out, and there's just so much access that you wouldn't have like in a basketball, for example.
Yeah, it's very different. Like, look at you, man. I mean, you're doing this podcast and chatting with me who's calling the fights tonight. Like, anybody can cover the sport in a different way. Like, if you want to start a blog about, if you want to start a blog about the Green Bay Packers, like I can do that from Las Vegas, but am I going to
Yeah.
get Aaron Rodgers or like, their coach on my show? Like, it's going to take a while and you got to build something before you're going to get that. You can't just, you kind of have to be a credentialed member of the media that goes to practice and that's working for a specific outlet. Meanwhile, like, if you just grind and you just decide that you want to start an MMA blog or a YouTube channel or whatever, like, you just send a note on Twitter
Yeah.
or Instagram to some of these fighters and some big names in the sport. Like I said, they're down to earth people, guys and girls, and well educated, like to give their time. And it also behooves them to get their name out there, to speak to people, to do what they can do. They don't just have to hide behind. I always say hide behind the logo. When you're a pro athlete and you're playing for one of the major professional sports teams, you don't have to be nice to the media.
Yeah.
You just don't. I mean, it's good to, and most of them are, but you don't have to, because you play for the Patriots and people are going to be Patriots fans and they're buying Patriots tickets. You don't have to be this nice guy that's like good to the media and giving of your time in interviews. There's certain things you have to do, like after a game or in practice or whatever, whenever the media sessions are. But other than that, you can just be like, well, I play in the NFL. I play for the Patriots. This is what I'm going to do with my time and whatever. So with UFC, it's a lot more accessible.
Well, and you mentioned the thing, like it feels like anybody could do it, right? Anybody could start a blog and a YouTube channel, and that scares me sometimes. Is you'll have people that they ask you for advice and stuff, and you feel like, man, if somebody could, somebody could easily replace me, like you know what I mean? If they start getting some kind of access, like they could just, I feel sometimes like any idiot could just come on in and just do what I do, and it's scary sometimes because you think like your place could be threatened by someone that maybe more ambitious or has it figured out earlier than you do.
Well, that's the key, man. You can't let somebody else be more ambitious.
Yeah, that's true.
I think you just answered your own question. But like, there's gonna be competition no matter what you do, and like, yeah, it's one of those things. Like, I have a podcast and I have a YouTube channel, and of course, like, if you're watching somebody else's, you can't watch mine. If you're listening to somebody else's podcast, you can't listen to mine. But like, there's a lot of people that will never cross that barrier. You know what I mean? Like, you got to knock on 300 doors to get what you want. And a lot of people will knock on 3 doors and be like, it's not working for me. You know what I mean? You just got to keep going. So, and you can't worry. You can't be tied to a result, in that line of work. You can't be like, I'm going to do a podcast and I'm going to do 20 episodes. And if I don't have 200 downloads by then I'm going to stop it. You have to, if you don't like doing it, then don't do it. But if you're doing it and you're just like, you know what, I really like this, I'm going to keep doing it. That's what stage I'm at with my podcast. It's like, I talk to fighters and I interview fighters. And after I'm done chatting with them for a while, it's like, man, I loved getting to know that person. And it's going to help me out in my job if I ever call one of their fights. And now I have this connection and it's awesome. If other people want to listen to it, whether it's 1,000 or 10,000, then that's great. If they don't, I don't care. I just had a great conversation with somebody. So I think that's how you got to approach it.
Well, I think that's the thing when you make content too. Like in your mind, it's like you worked hard for this and you're proud of it. It's like you busted your ass and you did something that's great. And in your mind, it's like, this should have 10,000 views within like the first 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. And you
Yeah.
never know what to expect. Let me tell
Yeah.
you that too. Like, you'll do something, you're just like, this is a good episode. This is going to do good numbers. Like, this is going to do numbers. This is a good one. It's like a bigger name, whatever. And then like, it'll start, it'll hit the airwaves or whatever, and you'll kind of drop it and then just be like, well, that's weird. I thought more people. And then like in time, people, a lot of interviews are evergreen, at least the ones that I do they're evergreen. So it's just like people can find their way into it and then it'll come around. And then others, you're just like, well, I don't know. This is like it's a name that unless you're a hardcore fan, maybe you haven't heard of and, whatever, but then that one will go crazy or so you just never know. You just got to do it for the love of it. And, you never know what's going to hit and what's not.
I agree with that. That was the thing with this podcast too. Like I started working full time and it was like, it took the time away from covering MMA and it was like, if I want to continue to make content, but I want to do something I like to do. And, with this podcast, I'm having a lot of fun with it, talking to different people and even the fighters I've had on. It's like I normally do the 10, 15-minute video interviews. You don't get the same fighters when you sit down for an hour and have a conversation. Like you really get to see who these people are aside from, I really like the matchup and his boxing's good. Like,
Yeah,
it's interesting getting to see that whole different side of people when you make content like this.
exactly, man. I mean, I'm the same as you. Like I have a job, which is of course in the UFC, but at the same time, if I want to do those interviews, it's separate from
Yeah.
like what I need to do tonight to call the fight. So, my theory on that is to just keep it simple, right? Just like, no matter how busy I get, do I have an hour to try to line up, you know, to talk to somebody else? It's like, of course I do. You know what I mean? And then like, if you keep it simple and you just here, we talked for an hour. You can watch it if you want.
Yeah.
You can listen to it if you want. Like that's how simple it's got to be sometimes. And then, of course, there's a bunch that you can do if your time loosens up. If you make it to a level where you can hire a support staff or something. Okay, we can clip this off. We can put some graphics on this. We can add to it, or like, depending on what your schedule is, if you're busy that week. So yeah, I mean, that's how it goes, man. It's kind of a fun journey, and it's certainly a different media landscape than when I was coming up. But I think it's cool that a lot of people can get involved in it.
So, I mean, you took a different approach with your podcast and even your YouTube channel, because I know at first your thing was you did this stuff in person, right? You had Forrest Griffin, Safe
Yeah,
Salad, all those guys, and now today we're seeing you. You're kind of doing what we're all doing, which is doing things remotely. I guess you're using Zoom and stuff like that. Like, how's that been for you?
yeah, it's good, man. I mean, like you said, so there is nothing like an in-person interview. Like when you can sit down and look at you just notice more. It's kind of like when we call the Contender Series, we sit in a studio. So like as an example, because we don't want to be, and we've done that for all seasons. We'll do our intro out by the octagon, and then we kind of sit in the back because it's too quiet to like just call the fights from right there. And of course, now for the UFC fights, we call them right there without a crowd, but it's still not like they're hearing us as well. Um, and you just notice so much more when you're in the room. When you're in the room, when you can see the fighters moving in front of you, it's just so much different than watching it on a TV. And same goes for interview. When you can just sit down with a person and look them in the eyes and be in their presence, you get a better connection and you can kind of speak in a different manner. But so I didn't want to do remote interviews from the beginning because I was just like, no, I'll just do less of them. Then the pandemic hits, and I'm like, well, I'm not doing in-person interviews for quite a while. So let me just shut this podcast down. And then everybody started doing remote stuff. Jimmy Fallon's doing remote
Yeah.
interviews. Howard Stern's doing remote interviews. People on the news everywhere are working from home and anchoring their show. So I'm like, okay, now this is like going to become a way of life for a while. So it's like normal for people to watch content in this format. And I noticed that there was a few interviews that I listened to. I don't listen to Howard Stern regularly, but I really like I'm a fan of him. Like I understand how good he is at what he does, and like he's interesting. I just don't want to pay for Sirius Radio, and I
Right.
don't have that time to listen to the show all the
Yeah.
time. But they gave a free trial during the pandemic, like early in the pandemic. They gave out Sirius XM for free for like until like the end of May. So in that time, he had an interview with Tom Brady. Tom Brady was in Tampa doing the interview just like this with his earbuds on, and it was like a 2-hour interview. He had him on for like the whole show. And even their video, like Brady's web connection wasn't good, so then they just had to switch to a phone call. And I
Oh,
still listened to every bit of that 2 hours, and I was compelled by it. Like I wanted to listen to it, and there were good questions, and it was good answers, and I was like, well, that's a pretty good interview. And that's the worst case scenario. It was a
yeah.
choppy
Right.
connection, and then it was on the phone. And I still wanted to listen to it because of how good it was. Obviously, not every person you interview is going to be Tom Brady, but that was one. And then another one, Jerry Seinfeld was on with Howard Stern. Did the same thing. He was sitting remotely with a connection like this. And I was just like, I listened to 2 interviews that I made appointments to listen to it. Like I saw on Twitter, and I was just like, I got to listen to that. And I made time to listen to it, and they were both remote interviews, and they were both really good. And I was just like, well, then I have no excuse. Like why shouldn't I be doing this? I have access to so many fighters, that I know personally, or that I've called their fight, or they know who I am because of the job that I have. And I'm just like, goes back to your point about being ambitious. It's like, why am I gonna sit back and be like, nah, if I can't be in person, I'm not going to do my show. And like maybe down the road, I'll fire my show back up and whatever. It's just like, no, man, that's weak sauce. That's like loser's mindset right there of just like, maybe that's not grinding for it. I had to decide if I wanted to do it, because you do have to want to do it. And I was just, every time I put it on hold and was just like, maybe this isn't for me right now, or just this is a project that can be put on hold. I would like within a week, I would start thinking, I'm just like, why am I not doing it? It's like, I
Yeah.
have no good excuse for it. I do want to do it. Like if you ask me, what project would I like in addition to what I'm doing, I would tell you a successful podcast, right? And like I would start like being woken up at night by these thoughts. Oh, I could do this, I could do this, I could have this person on and whatever. And so got back into it, and it's been good. I figured out a system. I figured out that people do like it, and I just try to have guests on that I already have somewhat of connection with. Like instead of meeting them for the first time over a Zoom chat, a fighter that I've called, or somebody that I've known and stuff like that, where then we can kind of pick up from from where we knew and saw each other in person.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough. Just like what we're doing, meeting for the first time. There's some guys like it works, and others where it doesn't. And you see it with a lot of these interviews with the fighters. Some fighters they'll only talk if you put a question mark at the end of your sentence. Otherwise, they'll just wait for you to finish up whatever you're doing. And some guys are really great. Like yesterday, I had Dwight Grant. Oh, he was awesome. I mean, we were talking back and
Yeah.
forth, having a conversation, talking about who knows what. Like we were talking about so much stuff. At the end, you have to do like a recap on Twitter. So why would you watch? Because we talked about this. I don't even know what we talked about. It was just an
Yeah.
hour, and we were just talking about whatever popped up. So some guys are really great for it, and that's why for me, I made a list. I was like, who do I think would do well in that kind of thing?
Right.
And then because if you could have a big name, but if that big name doesn't know how to talk or isn't willing to do the back and forth, you're gonna struggle getting to that hour, and all it's gonna do is it's gonna look like crap because you both have to be willing to sort of play that game.
Why do you always say an hour? Like, why are you married to an hour?
I don't know. It just seems like the kind of the length that I've found that it seems like, most people seem to like the hour. I know when I listen to a podcast, I like for it to be an hour. I don't know. It's just something that I don't know. It just
Yeah. So like what I would say to you is like because I always tell people too, if I'm going to do a show with them, like it's probably going to be an hour,
yeah,
just to give them a heads up, because there's nothing worse than you agree to an interview and you think it's going to be 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever, and then you're sitting there and then like you're mid interview and you're like, you don't want to be rude, but you're like,
right.
how long
Yeah.
is this? Hey man, how long are we going to go?
Yeah.
So it's like, in an hour is a chunk of time, right? Like you're not asking for a quick 10 minutes or
Yeah.
something like that, which 10 minutes is pretty easy to find time for, but an hour you got to set aside. But I would say to you, like, because I've done podcasts, and like I said, an hour is the general rule of thumb, especially if you're going to have a real connection, get the life story, or go into whatever you're going to talk about. But like, if you're talking with somebody and they're a little short on answers or whatever, and
Yeah.
you're at like 42 minutes, like,
Yeah.
call
Wrap
it,
it up.
man. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like I'd rather listen to a tight 42 than have you try to like
Yeah.
pile on to somebody that's not expanding on their answers, and that just to get to 60 minutes. Like you don't have to fulfill any commercial
Yeah. That's true.
obligations. Like you
That's
don't have
true.
to like, when you're hosting a show on ESPN and it's an hour long, like you got to have content for an hour, right?
That's true.
Because you
Yeah.
got 4 commercial breaks or whatever it is, and like you got to be like, okay, we're going this, we're going this. Like you got to fill that hour before Sports Center's next or whatever
Yeah.
it is. But man, on streaming something on YouTube or a podcast, like I don't hate sometimes. Here's the other thing. Sometimes people have a 38-minute drive to get where they're going. And they're like, well, I don't want to listen to this podcast. It's an hour 10,
Yeah.
but I got a 30-minute drive ahead of me. I'll get most of this 38 minutes. And if it's good, I'll bite off the rest on the way back, So sometimes I don't listen to Rogan because I'm like, this podcast is 2 hours and 42 minutes. I'm not even going to start it. Why
Yeah.
even start it? And obviously his is like kind of a talk show that's a longer form thing. And sometimes I really like it. And sometimes I'm like, I need to listen to this guest and I want to listen to all of it. And other times I'm like, yeah, this is an interesting dude, but it's not for me if it's 2.5 hours.
Yeah, some of his shows are pretty like 3 hours and 30 minutes, and it's like,
It's
how are you
crazy,
guys
man.
not exhausted? Like, there's no way. Like, how
I
can I
mean, I
mean,
think it's good. When you think about it, like, radio shows oftentimes, obviously there's commercial breaks. I'm talking like, I don't know, can you call it old school radio? I mean, people like you, it's like the radio still exists, right? I almost never listen to it, but like, Colin Cowherd's on Fox Sports Radio. His show's 3 hours. Like in Boston, our sports talk shows were in 4 hour blocks. They were 6 to 10, and then 10 to 2, and then 2 to 6, and that's how it went. But that's commercial breaks and whatever. Like if you're going 3 hours with somebody just sitting in a room, but if you're truly curious about somebody and what they do, I could sit here and talk for 3 hours. You know what I mean? Like I can't today, but I physically if I have the time to have a good conversation with somebody, we all talk all day.
That's true.
You know what I mean? It's just in a manner of which way you're doing it.
Well, I know for the 10, 15-minute fighter interviews, you have sort of an idea of what the algorithm's like and stuff like that. And there was one fighter, it's like we got 7 minutes and it was such a drag. Like, you'd ask him a question and the answer would be like, yeah. And then you're like, oh man, how am I going to do that? And then, we got 7 minute mark. I was like, what, I'm going to call it, because what's the point? Like, it's not going to turn out any good.
No, I mean, the thing is, in those types of situations, you have to go back to, like, in your toolbox, Lucas, you should have, I'll give you some advice here because I've dealt with a lot of that subject, whether it's a patriot, whether it's a high school football player, whatever. Sometimes it's nerves, sometimes they don't want to talk, whatever. You got to have some go-to questions that leaves them no other choice but to talk, like, don't ask a yes or no question, because like you said, if they just say yeah, well, it's just like, well, you asked them a question where they could say yes and get away with it. Like, how's the weight cut going? Is the weight cut okay? Yes. Right. And if they don't want to keep talking, they're not going to keep talking. Or if they're just like a shy person or whatever, I would, you can always go to, how would you describe whatever you're talking about, right? How would you describe the weight cut? Then they can't say yes or no. They got to give you something on that, right? They got to give you something, and then maybe you can listen to that and then follow up on it, right? So it's like, how would you describe? That's a really good off the shelf question. And then, like, how do you feel about whatever? Like these simple questions where sometimes interviewers, I make this mistake, but interviewers will try to give options, yes or no questions, or man, was that an easy thing for you to do, or was that a bit of a challenge?
Yeah.
It's just like, well, then you're giving them the first part of the answer, like they're gonna have no choice, but you're just giving them a way out to make an easy canned answer, and that's not what you want as an interviewer. So just have those things, and just don't be afraid to not talk. Don't be afraid to just be like, how would you describe the weight cut? And then if he doesn't talk right away, don't jump in, because a lot of people do this. They'll go, how would you describe the weight cut? And he's thinking for an answer, because you're forcing him to think, right? You're forcing that person to do something. And while they're thinking of their answer, you might jump in because you're afraid of the silence. It feels awkward, and just be like, because some people, it's like a real challenge if they're going down in weight, in a new weight class, there's some nerves to go along with it. Now you're just rambling. Now you're lost. And now he's not thinking, he's just trying to react to what you're doing. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's the thing too with the questions. I talk, and you had an interview with James Lynch, I believe it was last week or something like that. And we talk about this often, but it's sort of keeping your questions short. Like, there's some guys where they'll give you a whole paragraph as a question, and I'm like, I forgot the question. I'm sure the fighter forgot the question. Like, how are you going to do that? Like, it really, I feel like there needs to be a focus on the subject and not you sort of showing off how much you can fit into your question.
Huge. That's great. That's great that you know that. A lot of people go their whole career and never know that. I mean, lots of people that reach high profile positions in broadcasting. They and like I told James last week, because there was a guy, John Sawatsky. Was that the interview I mentioned it in? I did a bunch of interviews like on one day last week. James was on a different one, but there was a guy at ESPN that was like a talent consultant. Like, he worked with the on-air people and producers and stuff, and anybody who did interviewing and was in like storytelling kind of content. And man, this guy wasn't the most important influence in my career, but he says, when you're doing an interview, there's one star in the interview, and it is not you. That's the simple formula. Now it's different what we're doing, And sometimes on my show, I'll go into conversation mode because there's conversation, right? That's two. That's two people's thoughts. And then there's interview, right? And this one with you, this is a conversation, right? Because we're talking sports in the beginning and we're going back and forth, and that's fine. But when it comes down, and you can switch modes right in the same show.
Yeah.
You can go from conversation to whatever, and then be like, all right, let's get down to it. It's interview time. And then like you tee up questions that will force an answer, use as little words as possible, and be prepared to shut up and like get the good stuff, and try to get them to go deep. And if they say something interesting, follow up. And that's the way to do it. So you're allowing me to ramble on, which is phenomenal on your part, right? Now that we're in interview mode. But yeah, I mean, it's good to know those lessons because a lot of people never learn them.
When you started with doing the video stuff, like I think a lot of people, they see like the interviews people put up on video and they think it just happened. Like they don't realize how much stuff is in the background. How were you able to figure out how to do, sort of put these things side by side? Like did you use Zoom like a lot of people, or did you sort of figure out a different way of doing things?
Oh, on my show, like on
Yeah,
the
on your
YouTube channel.
podcast. Yeah, yeah.
Um, honestly, I kept it as simple as possible. Like how do you do it? Like StreamYard, I've done a few guest appearances on this, and this is like a good look. So I got to look up StreamYard, but yeah, I just do Zoom because of how easy it is.
Yeah.
Like Zoom is, and I don't do the side by side. I do like whoever's talking that
Yeah,
goes to
yeah.
full screen, so it's like back and forth. Because when you're doing an in-person show, like if I'm doing a sit-down interview for the UFC that they set up with like a 3-camera shoot, like think about how that looks. It's not split screen. It's whoever
Yeah,
the person is
yeah.
talking about. So that's just my preference for the show that I'm doing. But so you just put it on that setting, and then you hit record on Zoom, and then once the thing's over and you hit end, it saves to a file, and that's it. And then I just put it in there and just drop it. So I just try to make my background somewhat like in my office with like the logo and stuff. And I know it could be a lot better, but I just try to keep it simple, easy to set up so that it's not a big to-do list and stuff like that. And make sure the audio is good. That's the
Yeah.
most important thing. But yeah, I mean, I do it as simply as possible. I know that there's better ways to do it. James Lynch was like, he's like Skype, the picture's clearer, and like these pictures are pretty clear right now, but I'm just taking my time with it. Maybe over the holidays when I have a few weeks with no UFC events to get ready for, then I can clean it up, maybe improve the show a little bit.
Well, the thing is, just how much video editing. I thought it was sort of like, when I first started, I was like, you could just, I don't know, I guess it just happens. And then, I talked to someone like James Lynch where it's like, listen, you have to record the Skype window, record yourself using your webcam, put them together, add your audio from Audacity.
Yeah.
Like it was such a grind.
So
And
that's where I'm not doing it.
yeah,
Like that's where I'm just like, I can't do all that right now. But
yeah,
James can do it because his job,
yeah, that's just full
his
time.
number one thing is like he's doing those interviews, he's making them look as good as possible, sound as good as possible, all that stuff. And I started doing that at the beginning. I was like, okay, camera on me, I'll edit this in or whatever. And then you're just like, this is taking forever.
Yeah.
I was like, that is another reason that held me back from doing the remote thing, because I'm just like, geez, if I'm just in person, I could just hit go on my recorder. Audio, it was audio only at first too. I didn't have cameras, and I just wanted to keep it as simple as possible. And then you start being like, well, what if I had video? And then I'm starting to bring like a camera, and then I'm just like, oh my goodness, to make this look and sound good, I'm just giving myself 5 people's jobs in addition to like the interview itself. So I was like, I don't want to do that. I want to keep it as simple as possible. And luckily, our technology in the 21st century has allowed us to do that pretty easily, especially on things where you can just click a record button.
Well, there's a lot of people, they think like, everybody needs to do something in studio. Like, I had Mike Rodriguez who was like, if I could, I'd build a basement, and it's saying, for me, like build a table or something. It's like, man, not only do you have to get, the mics right and you have to have the right mixer and everything, you have to get lights, you have to get cameras. And like Joe Rogan, I think he's got 3 different angles from the cameras. It's like, man, and I have to do all that by myself while at the same time hosting the show. Like it would look great, but it's too much. You can't make that happen.
Yeah, like you need a simple, when you're starting out, you need a simple system. And I started wrapping my head around that. Like, of course, the dream is to have a studio,
Right.
And to have a place where you can and have a staff, right? I mean,
Right.
if you're pulling an income off of it, cool, then you can hire somebody to do the editing and the content and the social media push and whatever. And my job is to be prepared for that interview, because that's the most important
Yeah.
part of the show, is the actual content of what you're talking about. And so if you start biting off all these other jobs, you're stretching yourself too thin and the show suffers. So for me, it's the easiest right now to just be able, like, yeah, okay, I could have better video quality. I could have a little more editing. I could do a little more marketing in terms of the show or whatever. But there's a lot of people that do a lot more with a lot less. They do a lot more numbers and have higher subscriber counts and whatever, and they don't have the
Yeah.
profile job that I have in terms of my role. Like, I'm sitting next to Bisping and DC on ESPN later today. I mean, a lot of people don't have that. So I just need to be patient with that. And of course, the dream is to have a studio and a
Yeah.
staff and be like, cool, my show is successful. This
Right.
is awesome, and I can get a lot of these interviews, and most of them can be in person and great stuff. But that can come in 2030 for all I care. You know what I mean? Like, or 2025 or whatever ends up happening. But as long as I like doing it, which I do, then I'm gonna keep doing it. And I think that that's really the most important thing, when it's not like your sole source of income, your job or whatever. It's just like, this is a fun thing I like to do. It could turn into something more. It could turn into a bigger dream job than I ever thought possible. But for right now, this is what it is, and you have to be okay with that.
I think for a lot of people, the dream is, the Joe Rogan thing. You build your own studio, you have the statues or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, you come in the morning, you say hello to your staff as they're preparing the lights and everything. You just sit down, maybe prepare a whiskey or whatever weird thing you're gonna do on the show. Like, I think everybody kind of figures that's the goal, that's the end game.
Yeah, it's cool that that's the end game. What you have to realize is that you can't do that from like year one.
Yeah,
You can't just be like, I'm going to have a podcast and this is how it's going to be. It's just
yeah,
like, no, it's not. Like, if you want, I mean, I'm not at the point of having ads on my show, and I feel
yeah,
like it's going to be, I mean, you don't want to like limit yourself. You don't want to be like, well, it's going to be at least 2 years, because it's like, who knows? But
yeah.
um, you can't start. I see like sometimes these articles are just like, why you should start a podcast. Well, you can make some money from it. You can monetize from it. It's just like, dude, you got to like grind for like 3 years, I feel like, to get ads in your podcast. You know what I mean? Like, I was super naive when I had Forrest Griffin on. Well, the first interview I did was Yancey Medeiros, but the first episode that I actually put out was Forrest Griffin. I remember thinking like, oh, I'm going to release this. It's going to
Yeah.
be the new MMA podcast. People are going to love it, whatever. And then like the download numbers are what they are. And you're just like, oh, you mean not everybody just dropped everything and
Right.
found time for my show? Found like 58 minutes to listen to Forrest Griffin's life story. Like, and it's a good episode and it's a good story, and I think the interview is good. But at the same time, I was just like, oh, okay, this is going to be a longer road than I thought. And again, you can't make it about making money. You have to be like, I love doing it, and you have to be willing to put some dollars in. Right? There's like a podcast hosting fee or whatever, and if you want a good microphone, that all that sort of stuff. But um yeah, I mean, you got to be in it for the long haul if you want that. Everybody wants the studio where you show up in a staff and you put your podcast out. That's awesome, and you can make all of your money off of hanging out with other people and
Right.
chatting with them. But that's not how it works.
I think everyone figures when you make a podcast like that, like, the masses are waiting for you to release it. Like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna have this
Oh
guest
man,
on.
wait till people hear this. These are
Yeah,
interviews with fighters. Nobody's ever heard that before. Like, you do have to, like, on one hand, you're just like, everyone does this. Why would I do it? And then you have to wear the other hat and just be like, well, I'm going to do it in my way.
yeah,
And like, everybody does everything, like why do anything then? Why start a minor league baseball team? There's already 100 of them. Like, why would you try to be a sports announcer? There's already a ton of sports announcers. Just like, well, no, because you can do it. You just got to commit to it, and believe that your content's going to resonate with. You don't need to have everybody in the world like your stuff. You just need to
yeah.
carve out your following and make the most of it.
Well, that's the thing too. Like, everybody says, well, if everybody's doing it, it's like, yeah, but you got to add your own spin. Like, my thing, for example, is, you're gonna have a hard time finding people younger than me doing the same things that I do, and that's kind of the strength. Is, maybe for the younger generation or people that want, potentially a younger host, and then, you have to find the different things that people would look for that makes, what you're doing different. And I mean, even you, like, you have your things that make it unique, and you have a certain skill that lots of people that do it don't have necessarily, because they don't have the job you do. So unique things that maybe we don't notice, but the people watching might notice.
Yeah, like my show is a little unique in terms of how I interview. And then like I have to be confident that my skills as an interviewer are gonna ultimately carry um and mean something. Like the thing that I love the most is that I get comments from people and they're just like, "Hey man, that was a good episode. Like you asked different questions and like, oh, you did like a deeper dive and it wasn't about their fight camp or whatever. Like it was about a different thing." And then like I've even had some of the fighters like Anthony Smith that I had on my recent podcast. He texted me later in the day and he's just like, "Hey man, that was a really good conversation. Like you got to keep doing this because like that was different from any other interview I did and like we had a good chat and like that thank you for that. That was awesome." And so like obviously it's great when you hear that from
Yeah.
the person that you interviewed. Like, wow, I'm glad you enjoyed it because I did too. But then fans too, like ultimately the listeners who are going to sit there and listen to it, like I love those comments like great questions. That's different. And like, the art of the interview is just very different. And I went through the first 10 years of my career basically without knowing it. Like I said, that guy at ESPN, John Sawatsky, he kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things. And there were other people, he did that course for a lot of people. But unless it really resonates with you and becomes something that you really want to be good at, then it's not going to happen for you, which is why, like, I gave away some secrets, right? I gave away some of my secrets to you, where it's like, have those off the shelf questions. How would you describe this? Like, make them expand on their answers. And then when they say something interesting, follow up on it. Like, that's interviewing 101. But a lot of people will never develop those skills because they don't care to work on them. You can tell people 100 times. You can be like, "Hey, your questions are too long. Hey, don't ask yes or no questions."
Yeah.
By the way, these are mistakes I all still make. Like I make every single mistake on my podcast, on UFC broadcasts. Like I make these mistakes still. It's very unnatural, but I just do it less than most people. I generally keep my questions shorter than most people. I will sit there after asking a question that forces them to think, and I'll sit there in silence and look at them and make them talk. Like one of my favorite interviews is the one I did with Brian Ortega. It's up on YouTube. It's on the UFC's channel. It's on my channel too. Like I put it on a playlist below, but I did, and like he is just the perfect subject because he's a very deep thinker, and he also is not afraid to be candid. Like he's not afraid to admit like when he's afraid. You know what I mean? And that sort of thing. Like he's not this macho fighter. Like he'll sit there and he'll give you real answers and he'll think about them, but he'll only do that if you say, "What was it like to get ready for Max Holloway?" And then you got to leave it there. You got to leave it like that,
Yeah.
and you got to let him think about it. And it makes for good TV, man. People like that stuff. That silence is compelling when you're looking at him figuring out how he's going to answer something that's pretty deep. So that's kind of my style. And I still have fun on the show. Like I
Yeah.
still joke around when it's there. But I think people appreciate like some real answers and forcing people to think and explain stuff because I like it. Like I like this interview we're doing right here because you're letting me go and like we're going deep on my
Yeah.
podcast
Yeah.
instead of me answering for the 42nd time about going under the table in Mexico City. Now I'll answer that question, right? And I'm the one who brought it up here, but everybody else is just like, Mexico City, what happened? I'm just like, well, I've explained it 1,000 times.
Yeah.
So, this is a good one.
The Mexico City stuff makes me laugh. 'Cause I'm looking up your YouTube channel and your content because you do have good content. And one of the results is Brendan Fitzgerald, table under table stuff.
Yeah,
And it's
that's the most viral moment of my career
yeah.
right now, obviously. And it's just, I've called a couple of championship fights, but obviously they weren't pay-per-views. They were on ESPN Plus. So I haven't called like the biggest of the big fights. I've had some great moments in terms of what I've been able to call, but that's on TMZ, I think, or something. You know what I mean? Like that, just
Yes.
check out the UFC broadcaster that hit under the table. Like that's one of those things that will just cross over to all blogs. It becomes a clickbait thing. So that's fine. I mean, it's funny, but at the same time, like most interviews, it's just like this question, this question, this question, this question. It's better to go into something deeper on a single topic instead of just hit the broad strokes of like 20 different things.
Well, I was talking to Mark Montoya, and being a part of the media, I want to hear some of the behind the scenes, like how do fighters see the media and stuff like that. And he was saying the biggest thing with all these interviews is they get asked the same damn questions every time.
Yes,
He's like, guys will do 3 interviews in a row, and all of it. What do you think about your opponent? How's the weight cut? And it's like, yeah, it's the same. It's the same shit every time. That's why with
same.
podcasts, like we can dive on different subjects. It doesn't have to be an hour of why Brendan Fitzgerald was under that table.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just, yeah, no, it is. And I've only started realizing that for some reason over the last 3 weeks,
Yeah,
I've been hit with a bunch of interview requests, and some from like media, like I've heard of you, like I've seen you on Twitter and like James Lynch and stuff like that. And then others, like I'll try to find time for kids that are in college. And like if you tell people what's the biggest piece of advice? Well, start a blog, man, if you want to be a sports writer. Start a podcast and a YouTube channel if you want to be a broadcaster. You can do it with your phone, you can do it with a webcam. So if that's the piece of advice, and then they come to me and they're like, hey man, can we get you on our show? I always try to say yes. You know what I mean? Like you might have to wait 6 weeks depending on my work schedule and what I'm doing with my family, but I always try to say yes. So I've really just been hit with the realization that the fighters do get asked the same thing all the time, because I've done like 5 interviews in the last like 2 or 3 weeks, and more than 5. I've probably done like 8,
yeah,
and like most of them have been, and it's, again, they're students, they're learning, right? They're in college, some of them are in high school and stuff like that. So they're not going to be these developed pros. They're just trying to make the dream happen and get started. So I don't like begrudge them for it, but I'm just like, oh man, this is what it must be like for the fighters too. Just, this question, let's hit this question. Like Anthony Smith, I had him on the show. I didn't even ask him about the home invasion. If
oh
you
yeah,
want to know about the home invasion of Anthony Smith, you already heard it. He did like a half-hour show with Ariel
yeah,
Helwani just on the home invasion.
exactly, yeah,
So like, and if you didn't know about it, and we kind of, he mentioned it briefly or whatever, and we moved on, like that's fine. I've already heard it. I'm not interested in that for my show. You can hear that somewhere else. You have to be willing to leave stuff on the cutting room floor. And that was a challenge for me that I learned too, is just like, I can't go fight by fight with everybody.
yeah,
I can't go fight by because you go 45, 50 minutes before you even get to the UFC debut in terms of hearing an interesting thing about their lives and how they grew up and family tragedy or whatever it happens to be, their circumstance. And then you get to the UFC debut and they got 12 fights. Just like, all right, well, we're almost like, I don't want to keep them for that. Then you're at the Rogan 3.5 hour mark if you do that. So yeah, but it started hitting me like these fighters are getting most of the same questions, especially on like a fight week,
oh yeah.
especially on a fight week.
Or I had Mike Rodriguez, and I don't write down my questions. Well, I just think like there are topics I want to hit, but I wanted to flow as much as I can. And I'm thinking, all right, with him, he has a fight coming up in February. Let's make sure we hit on the fight. We did not hit on the fight. It was just
No,
an
you
hour.
don't have to. No,
Yeah,
yeah.
it didn't even happen. It just
What
it
is he
didn't,
gonna
it
say
didn't come
about
up.
the fight? What's he gonna
He
say about the
he
fight?
likes the matchup.
Going in there, man. Like the matchup. I'm ready, man. I believe I'm better everywhere. And
Yeah,
sometimes they want to give away the game plan. Like, yeah, man, I think my boxing's going to be too good for him. Or I think my jiu-jitsu. And some people are just like, I don't want to get into the game plan, man. I don't want
yeah,
to tell them what it's like.
yeah,
Yeah, it's just, there's so many canned responses that can go with that you're not getting anything of substance that
yeah.
gives people a reason to tune into your show. If like we're talking about how there's 100 other people that do interviews with fighters. Well, if 93 of them are the same, then like be one of the 7.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think I've ever had an interesting quote about the actual fight. There's not that many questions you can ask about it because you know as much as everybody else. Like, it's just okay. You're fighting this guy and you're preparing for him. And the fighters, yeah, it's the same thing. I like the matchup. I think this favors me. I hope with a win, I can. Do you have anyone you want to call out? Oh, I don't know yet. We'll see. And then they're
Yeah,
not going to
yeah.
call anyone out. It's not interesting.
Not to mention it could change opponents like 3 times.
Yeah, that
I mean,
too.
we're
Yeah,
talking like 2 months down the road, you know what I mean? So unless there's like a specific storyline, like sometimes it is there is something with talking about a fight, but for for like a long form interview and getting the thoughts on who they are. If you're talking about who they are, then you don't need to talk about the fight.
yeah.
If you're talking about specifically like what's next for them and covering fight week, then it is about that, and so there is a place for that, but it's not a requirement by any means, especially when you're like early fight camp or something like that. You know what I mean? It's just what you're going to get for a response.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems like people like the pre-fight coverage, like the pre-fight interviews, but at the same time, I don't understand what are you really getting from them? Like, Mike Rodriguez was telling me I get the same questions, and I talked to James Lynch once, and he asked me what my favorite TV show was. He's like, "Hold on, I wasn't even ready to talk about that." And he's like, "And now it
Yeah.
gets interesting, and now I remember who he is." So it's interesting, when you hear stuff like that, and then you can use that later because you're like, maybe try to be a little bit more interesting next time you interview
Yeah, and
someone.
if you are covering the fight stuff, like maybe just have a question or two that does give them a chance to like flex their personality a little bit, because like James is good at that. Like James,
Yeah,
I appreciate what James does because a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the downsides of some of like the canned responses and stuff, it's like, well, yeah, there's a lot of media that cover the sport that do a great job. Like you can't reinvent the wheel every time, too, and every fighter's going to have their own spin on it. But I do like how because James doesn't want to go too long. It's like a lot of his interviews are 10 minutes. And by the way, like my average watch time on a lot of my hour-long interviews on YouTube is about 10 minutes. You know what I
yeah.
mean? Like a lot of people want to be in that 8 to 12 minute range. So to get in as much as you can pre-fight, talk about the matchup, and then like a sprinkle of personality, like it's good. It's good in that mini form.
How did you for your podcast style? How did you decide that you wanted to go more the interview route? Like we mentioned, it's either conversation or interview, or
Yeah.
obviously you can mix a little bit of both. But it seems you really went with the interview route. Why was that kind of the style you went with?
Because when I learned about interviewing from John, I wanted to do more of it immediately. Like
Yeah,
I had never realized how much I love watching a good interview until I learned about what makes for good interviews. Because he then like had examples. He wasn't just telling us ask these types of questions. He was like, ask these types of questions. Here's an example why. And then he'd show us like Barbara Walters, like talking to Vladimir Putin. You
yeah,
know what I mean? Just be like, and Larry King, like long time interview show on CNN, like, and the mistakes that they made, right? Those are like the biggest names, but they would make the mistakes. They would ask yes or no questions. Like Barbara Walters once asked Putin if he had ever killed anybody. She just goes, "Have you ever killed anybody?" Right? And he was just like, "That sounds like a tough question, right? What do you think he's going to say?"
yeah. Just
No.
oh,
That's it. All he said was no.
yeah,
And so he was like, the real tough questions don't sound tough. The tough
yeah,
questions, the truly tough questions, demand thought and in a response from the person you're talking about. And it might be a tough question to answer, but it doesn't necessarily sound tough. She wanted to sound tough by sitting there and saying, "Have you ever killed anybody?" Like
yeah.
you just sound like a badass. You're asking the
Right.
Russian president if he killed anybody. And then he just says no. He just goes, "Niet." And then like that was it.
Yeah,
And it's just like, okay, it's like some sort of clip, but like that's not a good question. And
yeah,
people need to understand. And then they showed another. Diane Sawyer was talking to somebody else. It was like some drug kingpin. And instead of asking if you had ever killed anybody, she asked a question. She said, "What's the worst thing you've ever done?" Then he's
yeah, yeah.
squirming in the chair. Like he's
Right.
just silent. He's like squirming in the chair and just trying to figure out a way out. That's a good question. And she just said, "What's the worst thing you've ever done?" Like, so once those examples brought it to life in terms of what good questions are and what you don't want to do, I was like, oh my goodness. Like it was like coming out of the matrix in broadcasting. It really was. Like I was like, oh, I thought it was about me the whole time. I
Yeah,
thought I was the guy in the suit and tie on TV, so people wanted to see me, and it's
exactly.
not.
Yeah,
It's about the fights. It's about the analyst. It's about the former champion that knows a hell of a lot more than I do. It's about the interviewer, or the interview subject,
yeah,
that I'm talking to. And so once I realized that, I wanted to do a lot more of it, and I just had my jobs kind of went away from that. I actually used to interview people all the time in local news, and I never knew how to do it. Now, granted, they weren't long form interviews; they were more like in clips. But once I learned how to do it, I wanted to flex that muscle, and I
yeah,
went from working at ESPNU covering college sports to calling live fights. So you talk about going from not many interviews to less, and then I was just like,
yeah,
so I pitched to the UFC. I was like, I would like to do some more interviews. And they set it up like they were accommodating. They were like, I think that's a good idea. Let's do it. But I just haven't been able to do that many of them. It's got to line up. And especially in the pandemic, it's like totally on hold. But I was just like, well, I can do a podcast and interview people. So that's ultimately why I wanted that long form interview show, because I was like, I need to like do this more because it's a lot of fun and it's unique. It's still unique content because there's a lot of people that don't pour themselves into kind of the art of the interview like that.
But before I let you go though, tonight you mentioned you're going head to head with Bisping and Cormier, which are known for being two guys that when they talk, like they own it. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
do you prepare for something like that, or are you just waiting for there to be a pause and you jump in? Like I assume you can't just go in there and just without preparing something for guys like that.
Well, like my job stays the same in terms of calling the fights
Yeah.
and then having the background information that I'm comfortable with in terms of how I like to call a fight and a walkout and stuff like that. Like I'm still the leader of the show, but you just have to know who you're working with. So I worked with Bisping a bunch and I've worked with DC a handful of times. So I know what it's like to work with them. And I've worked with both of them too. I think we've done it twice. I think this is the third time we've done this trio. What I understand going in is like, I still want to have as much information as I'm used to having. But I know that they're going to talk a lot. So I have to then be prepared to not try to butt in, like let Bisping have the spotlight and DC and understand that they're going to go back and forth. There's going to be 3 to 4 minute stretches during fights where I don't say anything.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But I still have to put the stamp on the big knockouts or the submissions or the finishes. I still have to move our show along. I still have to tee them up on what we're talking about in between. And there's a lot of things. It's just the flow of it. It's really just understanding the different personalities. Like working with Bisping is different from working with Felder. It's different from working with Dom Cruz. And now I'm with Bisping and DC. So now like they're going to play off each other and they're going to go back and forth and they're going to banter and joke and they're going to poke fun at me for being a white belt, by the way. And like, we're going to have fun. And the last time I worked with them, I got a text from like my boss's boss. And he was just like, great job tonight. You let DC and Bisping shine, like you let them. And I was just like, yeah, DC and Bisping is what people want to hear from a hell of a lot more than me. My job is to like put a stamp on the big moments, get the best out of them, move the show along, steer the show, and tie up the loose ends. So as long as you're like know who you're working with and know how to handle it, at this point, since I've worked with everybody, I'm ready. We're gonna have a fun show.
Before I let you go, I know you like to start off your shows by letting people plug their stuff early, which is when most people would see it.
Yeah.
But
I'm working on that. I don't always do it.
I would do that, but I always forget. And and even
Me
at the
too.
end, sometimes I forget too. But I'm gonna give you a chance. You have social media. You're working tonight. You have a podcast. And everything.
Yeah.
If you like to plug that stuff, now's the time.
Social media, I'm at Brendan Fitz TV on Twitter and Instagram, and then the YouTube channel is FITZ NATION. I'm on every major podcast platform. If you want to just listen to it in audio, and man, appreciate all the support from anybody who's listened because it's been fun.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the time, Brendan. I really appreciate it. Hopefully tonight we don't hear a hoarse voice. If we do, I'll know it's a little bit my fault.
See, I won't have a hoarse voice tonight because they're going to do a lot of talking. So
That's
I
right.
should be
Yeah.
good in that department. Thanks, Lucas.
All
Appreciate
right.
it, brother.
Thank you so much.